Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Cornyn, Ernst, Hassan, McCaskill, Murray, Rounds, and Udall. Mr. Leahy voted in the negative. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Tester, no. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Ms. Smith, aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Wicker, aye. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Inhofe, aye. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Corker, aye. Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Portman, aye. Ms. Heitkamp. Aye. Thank you. Mr. Schatz. Aye. Sir, I'm sorry, what? Mr. Isaacson. Aye. Mr. Brown. Aye. Mr. Daines. Aye. Mr. Casey. Aye. Mr. Barrasso. Aye. Mr. Resch. Aye. Mr. Hoven. Aye. Mr. Crapo. Aye. Mr. Lee. No. Mr. Roberts. Aye. Ms. Cortez Masto. No. Ms. Duckworth. Aye. Mr. Cochran. Aye. Mr. Sanders. No. Mr. Perdue. Aye. Mr. Peters. Aye. Mr. Menendez. No. Mr. Blumenthal. No. Ms. Klobuchar. Aye. Mr. Murphy. No. Mrs. Shaheen. Aye.
Well, this young man said he's just learned.
Mr. Heller. Aye. Mrs. Gillibrand. No.
Where did Miss Kitty live? No, what?
Mr. Durbin. Aye. Mr. Gardner. Aye. Mr. Tillis. Aye. Mr. Flake. Aye. Mr. Enzi. Aye.
I thought you were going to say this is one of the most beautiful girls. What about these honors?
Ms. Murkowski. Aye.
I think I'm just harassed.
Mr. Sass. Aye. Mr. Cassidy. Aye. Mr. Booker. No.
You voted the wrong way.
Ms. Harris. No. Ms. Warren. No. Mr. Donnelly. Aye. Mr. Cardin. Aye. Mr. Nelson. Aye. Mr. Van Hollen. Aye. Mr. Burr. Aye. Mr. Merkley. No. Mrs. Feinstein. No. Ms. Collins. Aye. Mr. Cotton. Aye. Ms. Hirono. No. Mr. King. Aye. Mr. Whitehouse. Aye. Mr. Bennett. Aye. Mr. Reed. Aye. Mr. Markey, no. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Warner, aye. And Mr. Murrian, aye. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Hatch, aye. Mr. Lankford, aye. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mr. Rubio, aye. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Paul, no. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Toomey, aye. Mr. Blunt. Aye. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones, aye.
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote or wishing to change their vote? If not, the yeas are 81, the nays are 18. The motion to concur is agreed to with amendment.
Madam President,
Majority Leader?
could we have order in the Senate?
The Senate will be in order.
Madam President, after 3 days of an unnecessary lapse in funding, a bipartisan majority has brought the Democratic leader's extraordinary filibuster to an end and passed a bipartisan bill to reopen the federal government. As I've said repeatedly over the past week, shutting down the government is an irresponsible way to do business. It does not reflect the seriousness with which I know my colleagues on both sides would like to approach the people's business here in the Senate. All our important work for the American people had to be put on hold while this manufactured crisis was dealt with. We made no substantive progress, not 1 inch, on the serious bipartisan negotiations that will take to solve issues such as immigration and border security, health care, defense spending, and many other matters. So I'm glad we can finally get back to work here. Amid the political gamesmanship, the past 3 days have highlighted many of my colleagues' commitment to honest and bipartisan work. I'd like to particularly thank Senator Graham, Senator Collins, Senator Flake, and several of our Democratic colleagues who worked tirelessly to bring this impasse to a conclusion. Soon, federal operations will be getting back to normal for the American people. We all know what comes next, challenging negotiations on a host of serious issues. The weeks ahead will require the best from all of us. I hope we can remember some lessons from this regrettable incident. Brinksmanship and hostage-taking do not work. They make bipartisan progress harder, not easier, to achieve. Senators must focus on the common good of the American people, not the warped priorities of extreme voices, no matter how loudly they shout at us to do otherwise. With the pointless, damaging, partisan theatrics of this government shutdown behind us, serious and bipartisan negotiations can resume. We've been talking for months about how to address military spending, disaster relief, health care, immigration, and border security, and the rest of Congress' unfinished business. Now those talks can get going again. Whether they bear fruit is up to all of us. Now, Mr. President, I move to proceed to executive session to consider calendar number 594, Jerome Powell.
Questions on the motion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say no. Ayes appear to have it. Ayes do have it. Motion is carried. Clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, Federal Reserve System, Jerome H. Powell of Maryland, to be chairman of the Board of Governors.
I send a cloture motion to the desk.
Clerk will report.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Jerome H. Powell to be chairman of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, signed by 17 senators.
I ask to consent the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection,
I move to proceed to legislative session.
question is on the motion. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say no. Ayes appear to have it. Ayes do have it. Motion is carried.
I move to proceed to executive session to consider calendar number 597, Alex Azar.
Question is on the motion. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say no. Ayes appear to have it. Ayes do have it. Motion is granted. Clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, Department of Health and Human Services, Alex Michael Azar II of Indiana to be Secretary.
I send a cloture motion to the desk.
Clerk will report.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Alex Michael Azar to be Secretary of Health and Human Services, signed by 17 senators as follows.
I ask consent the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection,
I move to proceed to legislative session.
question is on the motion. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say no. Ayes appear to have it. Ayes do have it. Motion is granted.
I move to proceed to executive session to consider calendar number 620, Sam Brownback.
Question is on the motion. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed say no. Ayes appear to have it. Ayes do have it. Motion is granted. Clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, Department of State, Samuel Dale Brownback of Kansas to be Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom.
I send a cloture motion to the desk.
Clerk will report.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Samuel Dale Brownback to be Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom, signed by 17 senators as follows.
I ask consent the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection,
I ask unanimous consent the mandatory quorum calls for the cloture motions be waived.
without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the legislative session for a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business today, it adjourn until 12 noon Tuesday, January 23rd. Further, that following the prayer and pledge, the morning hour be deemed expired, the journal of proceedings be approved to date, and the time for the two leaders be reserved for their use later in the day, and morning business be closed. Further, following leader remarks, the Senate proceed to executive session and resume consideration of the Powell nomination. Finally, that the Senate recess from 12:30 until 2:15 to allow for the weekly conference meetings.
Without objection.
So if there's no further business coming before the Senate, I ask to stand adjourned under the previous order following the remarks of Senator Daines.
Without objection.
Mr. President,
Senator from Montana.
before I got involved in politics, I spent 28 years in the private sector. Small businesses, medium-sized businesses, Fortune 25 company. That Fortune 25 company was Procter & Gamble. I spent 14 years with that company, and one of our assignments took us to mainland China. I remember when we were offered the assignment and we took the job. That time we had our little boy David, our first child. He was about 18 months old. And our second child, Annie, she was just born. She was just a new baby, several weeks old. And we moved to Guangzhou. That was in January of 1992. And we were part of leading the team that pioneered the operations for Procter & Gamble back in the early days of the expansion of the company. Today, that geography, in fact, I think is P&G's second largest geography as it relates to sales in the world. And I remember we would spend some time with other American families from around the world. There were American families, there were families from virtually every continent. These expats living over there would spend time going to orphanages. We'd go in these orphanages, usually on a Saturday. We'd hold these babies. Sometimes they had disabilities. Some of these babies never received human touch, except for when these families, oftentimes American families, would go and hold them. And on a positive note, it built in a conscience, that orphanage. They knew the Americans were coming on Saturday. Things got cleaned up. The babies were getting a little better fed. That was a good thing. But we were fighting on behalf of those who had life and weren't being treated very well. I want to tell you a couple other stories about things that happened while we were over there in China. I remember I was running a large organization. I had many Chinese employees who were working for me. Remember one day one of my key managers came. He said, "Steve, I need to go to the police station this afternoon." And I said, "Oh, my word, is there something wrong? Do you need some help?" He said, "No, not really. My wife is pregnant, and we did not have permission from the authorities to get pregnant." And I said, "Well, what does that mean?" He said, "Well, that might mean they would terminate the pregnancy and require it." At that moment, I looked at that employee, one of my key managers, and I said, "I will do all that I need to do, all that I can, to ensure that we protect that baby, assuming you want to keep that baby." And he said, "My wife and I do want to keep that baby." So I said, "Well, what does help look like? How can I help you?" And he said, "Well, could I get a case of shampoo?" Now, we were making some well-known brands, Head & Shoulders shampoo, Vidal Sassoon, Pantene. We were making Crest toothpaste, then Tide. We had these world-class brands, and so I gave him a case of shampoo, and he went downtown to see the authorities. That case of shampoo saved the life of that baby, and they now have a beautiful grown daughter. Another day I was at work and my phone rang. My wife Cindy called me, and she said, "Steve, you won't believe it, but we just had twin baby girls dropped off on our doorstep in our apartment in Guangzhou." I said, "Twin baby girls, really?" And at that point, we had 3 children. So we went over to China with 2. We had 2 more, in fact, while we were living over there. By that time, we had 3. And she said they were just infants. And the story behind that, there was a mother who lived in the countryside who had one baby, a little girl, and she got pregnant with twins. And because of the one-child policy, she was in trouble, and she fled to the countryside. In fact, she was hiding in a remote location, and her mother would come out to feed the mother and the babies to keep them alive. To make a long story short, we battled for a couple of years because there was no paper trail for these 2 beautiful Chinese babies. And there was an American family that worked for Procter & Gamble, one of my associates, that wanted to adopt those babies. And I can tell you another happy ending to that story. They are now 2 beautiful young women who are living in the United States as U.S. citizens. These stories demonstrate the importance of saving one life at a time. I share these stories, Mr. President, because today is the 45th anniversary of the Supreme Court's decision on Roe v. Wade. And I know there's a lot going on at the moment. The Senate just voted to reopen the government. The House will follow shortly. The President will sign that. Common sense has prevailed. We've got the government open again. And in fact, we're reauthorizing the Children's Health Insurance Program for 6 years. But today, in the midst of all of these important issues that we're dealing with, we must not forget that each year in the United States, over 600,000 babies lose their fight for life due to abortion. No case of shampoo was able to save them. They never got the chance to be adopted. It's over 600,000 babies a year. 60 million since the Supreme Court's decision on Roe v. Wade in 1973, 45 years ago today. I told you a little bit about David when I started my remarks, our oldest son of our 4 children. David was born in the United States before we moved to China. And I think as a parent, and if you're a parent, you remember those new babies, you take them to get their shots. It's much harder on mom and dad than it is on the baby. The baby's screaming and crying, the pain they're feeling.